Imagine a narrow stone court under an unforgiving Athenian sun, the air dense with dust and murmurs, where a young man stands among the crowd and feels his city fracture in real time. Visualize Plato, not yet the architect of invisible worlds, but a witness at the edge of catastrophe, watching the trial of Socrates unfold as if Athens itself were on trial. The moment is balanced on a knife, a democracy accusing its most relentless conscience, a teacher accused of corrupting the youth, a student forced to learn what power does when it is afraid. What kind of life is born when justice condemns wisdom? And what must a thinker become after watching truth sentenced to death? How does a man rise not by taking power, but by rebuilding the very idea of what power should be, whether you're still tossing and turning in bed, driving down the highway, or simply looking for a wallpaper to work with? Grab your phone with 55% battery and join me for today's story. If I guess correctly, leave a like. If wrong, comment your current battery percentage. The crowd shifts, sandals scraping stone, as arguments echo that sound reasonable only because fear has taught them how to sound like reason. Plato listens, and in listening, he learns his first great lesson, that cities can speak with one voice and still be terribly wrong. He is young enough to believe in reform, old enough to recognize betrayal, and perceptive enough to sense that this moment will define not only his teacher's fate, but the shape of his own life. Athens, exhausted by war and humiliation, wants closure more than truth, order more than inquiry, safety more than wisdom. And so it chooses the comfort of condemnation. Plato watches Socrates speak without pleading, without rage, without retreat. He speaks as he always has, by asking questions that expose contradictions, by refusing the theater of remorse, by standing not as a defendant begging mercy, but as a citizen holding a mirror. This is not courage born of ignorance, Plato senses, but courage sharpened by clarity. Socrates knows the cost of honesty, knows that the city prefers obedience to examination, knows that a life spent questioning will end in judgment. And still he speaks. Plato feels admiration twist into dread, because he begins to understand that philosophy is not a safe pursuit of ideas, but a dangerous way of living. As the verdict approaches, Plato's thoughts move in threes, as if his mind instinctively seeks structure against chaos. He thinks of the city, proud and wounded. He thinks of the teacher, calm and unyielding. And he thinks of himself, caught between inheritance and awakening. He has been raised among privilege, surrounded by names that matter and expectations that narrow the future into respectable paths. Politics had once seemed inevitable, a stage on which talent and birth would naturally perform. But here, in this court, politics reveals its teeth. Plato begins to suspect that entering public life without first understanding justice is not leadership, but vandalism. The sentence falls like a dull blade. Death, not exile. Finality disguised as legality. Plato feels something inside him collapse, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the quiet certainty of a foundation cracking. This is the highest point of crisis, the moment from which everything else will descend. The city he loved has chosen fear over reflection. The law he respected has sanctioned silence. The teacher he followed has accepted his fate with a serenity that feels almost accusatory. Plato realizes that wisdom does not triumph by force, and that the truth when it threatens power, is rarely protected by it. As Socrates is led away, Plato's grief is complicated by shame. Shame that he could not save his teacher. Shame that he belongs to the same city that condemned him. Shame that admiration alone is such a thin form of loyalty. He learns that day that to love wisdom is not merely to listen, but to build something that can survive hostility. The seed of the academy, though decades away, is planted in this humiliation. Not an institution yet, not a philosophy yet, but a resolve that thinking must be protected from the moods of the crowd. The city returns to its routines with unsettling speed. Markets reopen, assemblies resume. Life continues as if nothing essential has been lost. Plato finds this continuity unbearable. He walks familiar streets that now feel altered, temples that seem complicit, laws that sound hollow. Athens has won its argument with Socrates by silencing him, but in doing so, it has revealed its own contradiction. It claims to love wisdom, yet kills the wisest man it knows. It celebrates freedom of speech, yet punishes the most honest speaker. It honors virtue, yet fears examination. Plato begins to understand that contradiction is not a flaw at the margins of human systems, but their central tension. In the nights that follow, sleep comes unevenly. Plato's thoughts circle the same questions, returning again and again like waves against stone. If a just man can be condemned by law, what is justice? If a city can destroy its best citizen, what is a city for? If wisdom offers no protection, what is its value? These questions do not yet have names like forms or ideas, but they have weight, pressing inward, demanding a life shaped around answering them. Plato is being transformed not by instruction, but by loss. This opening crisis does not make him heroic, it makes him cautious. He does not vow revenge, nor does he swear withdrawal from human affairs. Instead, he begins the long descent into learning, into context, into the slow accumulation of insight that will one day allow him to rebuild what has been broken. The execution of Socrates does not end philosophy in Athens. It relocates it, inward at first, then outward in a new form. Plato will carry this moment with him across decades, across journeys, across dialogues, returning to it again and again, like a wound that never fully closes, but never fully corrupts. And so the story begins not with certainty, but with fracture, not with triumph, but with a question forced into existence by injustice. The highest crisis of Plato's life arrives before his philosophy, before his travels, before his writings, leaving him with the burden that will shape everything that follows. Athens has spoken, and in its verdict, Plato has heard his calling, though he does not yet know its name. The memory of the courtroom slowly dissolves, and the narrative drifts backward through time, settling into an Athens that once felt stable, ordered, and inevitable. Plato's life does not begin in crisis, but in confidence. Born into an aristocratic family whose name carried weight long before his thoughts ever would. His lineage traced itself proudly through lawgivers and kings, men who had shaped the city with words, with weapons, and with authority. From his earliest days, Plato inherited not only wealth and education, but expectation. He was meant to lead, to speak, to rule. Philosophy was not yet destiny. It was merely an ornament among many privileges. Athens, at the time of his birth, was still intoxicated by its own greatness. The temples gleamed, The festivals pulsed with music and ritual, and the stories of victory against Persia were recited as proof that the city was favored by both gods and reason. Yet beneath this splendor ran an undercurrent of anxiety. Power had brought rivals, democracy had brought volatility, and freedom had brought voices that did not always agree on what freedom meant. Plato grows up absorbing this contradiction without naming it, sensing that Athens is both triumphant and fragile, both enlightened and reckless. His family home is a place of order and discipline, where poetry is memorized, music is practiced, and physical training is treated as a moral duty. Education is not optional for a child like Plato. It is the currency of legitimacy. He learns Homer not simply as literature, but as moral architecture. He studies rhythm and harmony not merely to entertain, but to shape the soul. From an early age, he is taught that balance is virtue, that excess is dangerous, that the good life is one lived in proportion. These lessons will later return transformed, hardened by experience into philosophy. But for now, they exist as cultural inheritance. Yet, even in childhood, Plato senses tension between appearance and reality. The men who speak most confidently in public are not always the most thoughtful in private. The assemblies that promise equality often reward charisma over wisdom. The democracy that praises freedom can turn quickly toward suspicion. Plato watches elders argue politics at symposium tables, their voices rising with wine and certainty. And he begins to intuit that persuasion is often mistaken for truth. This early exposure does not yet produce rebellion, but it plants caution. The Peloponnesian War looms like a gathering storm throughout his youth. What begins as distant strategy gradually becomes lived reality. News of defeats interrupts festivals. Names of fallen relatives echo through households. Resources thin, tempers shorten, and Athens slowly learns that brilliance in speech does not guarantee success in war. Plato grows up alongside this erosion, watching confidence give way to bitterness, idealism corrode into blame. The city that had taught him pride now teaches him vulnerability. As the war drags on, Athens becomes harsher, more suspicious of dissent, more desperate for unity. Plato notices how fear reshapes values. Where questioning was once admired, it is now tolerated only within limits. Where debate was once spirited, it becomes strategic. The city begins to protect itself, not by becoming wiser, but by becoming louder. These years form the backdrop of Plato's adolescence, shaping his emotional landscape long before his intellectual one. He learns that history is not a distant chronicle, but a pressure that molds character. His aristocratic status shields him from hunger, but not from disillusionment. He is trained in rhetoric and athletic discipline, taught to admire statesmen and generals, encouraged to imagine himself someday standing among them. For a time, he does. Politics still glimmers as a calling, a way to restore order to a city sliding toward chaos. He believes, as many young men do, that talent combined with virtue can correct inherited flaws. This belief will not survive untouched. The home he grows up in reinforces the idea that leadership is a moral obligation. Plato is taught that to withdraw from public life is a kind of cowardice, that those with ability owe their service to the city. Yet even here, contradictions surface. Family members criticize the very institutions they serve. Laws are praised in theory, and circumvented in practice. Plato begins to recognize that tradition can preserve wisdom, but it can also fossilize injustice. Respect for the past does not guarantee clarity in the present. This early environment forms the decreasing slope of the emotional arc, a movement away from the sharp crisis of Socrates' death into the slower accumulation of context. Plato's childhood is not tragic, but it is instructive. It shows him how greatness can coexist with blindness, how noble intentions can drift into destructive habits, how a city can educate its youth without teaching them how to question the city itself. These lessons are subtle, almost invisible at the time, but they will later resurface with force. By the time Plato reaches early adulthood, the world he inhabits feels less certain than the one he was promised. The inherited script of political glory no longer reads as convincingly. The city has lost wars, lost confidence, and is beginning to search for scapegoats rather than solutions. Plato stands at the edge of this transition, still protected by privilege, still respected by name, but increasingly aware that the path laid out for him may lead not to justice, but to compromise. This is the soil into which Socrates will soon step, a teacher whose questions will cut through inherited assumptions like light through fog. But before that encounter, Plato must first be shaped by the city itself, by its triumphs and its failures, by its promises and its betrayals. His aristocratic birth does not determine his philosophy, but it gives him something essential to lose. And it is often loss, not comfort, that drives a man toward truth. As Plato moves from boyhood into youth, Athens itself seems to age alongside him, no longer the confident victor of old stories, but a city learning how to live with exhaustion. The Peloponnesian War is no longer a distant rumor carried by messengers. It is a constant presence, shaping daily life through shortages, fear, and moral compromise. Plato walks streets where pride has thinned and suspicion has thickened, where every debate carries the unspoken question of survival. This is a city at war, not only with Sparta, but with its own self-image. The democratic assemblies continue to meet, but their tone has changed. Once, argument felt like exploration. Now it feels like combat. Plato listens as speakers promise safety, revenge, or restoration, each claim louder and more absolute than the last. He notices how easily crowds are moved by fear, dressed as patriotism. The art of rhetoric, once taught as a tool for clarity, becomes a weapon for domination. Plato begins to sense that speech, untethered from truth, can be more destructive than silence. In these years, Athens experiments with extremes. It clings to democratic ideals while flirting with oligarchic control. It celebrates freedom while enforcing conformity. Plato observes regimes rise and fall in rapid succession, each claiming necessity, each leaving scars. The brief tyranny of the 30, brutal and unapologetic, exposes how quickly law can be repurposed into cruelty when restraint is abandoned. Even after democracy is restored, the memory of that violence lingers, a reminder that systems are fragile and virtue cannot be assumed. Plato is old enough now to see patterns where others see chaos. He notices that political failure is rarely born of ignorance alone. It emerges from excess, from ambition unchecked by reflection, from confidence unbalanced by humility. Athens does not collapse because it lacks intelligence, but because it mistakes cleverness for wisdom. This distinction begins to haunt him. Clever men win arguments. Wise men ask whether the argument should be won at all. His education continues formally, but his real schooling takes place in observation. He studies the faces of generals returning from defeat, the shifting loyalties of politicians, the quiet despair of citizens who once believed in collective greatness. He learns that democracy, without moral discipline, can become tyranny by majority. He learns that oligarchy, without justice, becomes tyranny by elite. In both cases, power concentrates while responsibility evaporates. The war also reshapes Plato's understanding of virtue. Courage, once imagined as battlefield heroism, now appears in quieter forms: restraint, honesty, endurance. He sees men praised for brutality and men punished for moderation. The moral vocabulary of the city grows confused, and Plato feels the unease of living in a place where words no longer align with deeds. This confusion will later drive his obsession with definitions, with clarifying what justice, courage, and goodness truly mean. There are moments of temptation. Plato still considers politics, still imagines himself using reason to repair what force has broken. He believes, briefly, that a well-educated aristocrat might guide the masses towards stability, yet each political upheaval chips away at this confidence. The city seems resistant not to leadership, but to self-examination. Plato begins to suspect that no system, however well designed, can survive if the souls within it are disordered. Athens at war becomes a living lesson in contradiction. It prides itself on freedom, yet imprisons dissenting voices. It claims rational superiority, yet follows emotional tides. It venerates law, yet bends it under pressure. Plato does not yet articulate these observations philosophically, but they accumulate, forming a quiet indictment. He starts to believe that the deepest political problems are not procedural, but psychological. They originate not in constitutions, but in character. These years mark a further descent along the emotional arc, away from the sharp shock of crisis and into the slow, sobering weight of context. Plato is learning not from a single catastrophic event, but from prolonged exposure to failure. The war teaches him that history is not guided by ideals alone, but by the interplay of fear, desire, and ignorance. It also teaches him that understanding this interplay may be more important than winning any single argument. By the time the war finally ends, Athens is diminished, its empire fractured, its confidence shaken, its moral authority questioned. Plato stands amid the aftermath, young yet already disillusioned. He has seen democracy falter and tyranny emerge, seen brilliance serve destruction and ignorance wield power. He has learned that political life, without philosophical grounding, is a cycle of overreach and collapse. This city at war with itself becomes the crucible of Plato's emerging worldview. It convinces him that reform cannot begin with laws alone. It must begin with education, with the shaping of desire, with the training of the soul to love truth over victory. These conclusions are not yet fully formed, but they are taking shape, preparing him for the encounter that will transform these observations into a mission. The war has not given Plato answers, but it has stripped away illusions, leaving him exposed to a deeper, more demanding question of how a city or a human being might live justly at all. The meeting between Plato and Socrates does not arrive with ceremony. There is no thunder, no revelation, no sense that history is shifting in the moment itself. It happens instead in the ordinary spaces of Athens, in the margins of daily life, where questions are asked not to impress, but to unsettle. Plato first encounters Socrates as a presence more than a figure, a man whose appearance contradicts expectations and whose speech refuses comfort. In a city obsessed with reputation, Socrates seems curiously indifferent to how he is perceived. Plato is drawn at first by curiosity, then by irritation. Socrates does not teach in the manner Plato has been trained to expect. He offers no lectures, no doctrines, no polished rhetoric. Instead, he asks questions that feel almost naive, then follows them with relentless patience until confident answers unravel. Plato watches respected men falter, their certainty exposed as imitation rather than knowledge. This is not humiliation for its own sake, Plato senses, but a method, a stripping away of pretense to reveal ignorance as the starting point of wisdom. What unsettles Plato most is not Socrates' intelligence, but his moral posture. Socrates is poor by choice, unafraid of ridicule, and unmoved by power. He speaks to craftsmen and politicians with the same tone, measuring all claims by the same standard. In a society where status dictates who may question whom, this equality is radical. Plato begins to realize that Socrates embodies a form of freedom unknown to the city. Freedom from the need to win, to dominate, to please. As Plato joins the circle around Socrates, he feels his inherited assumptions fracture. The virtues he was taught to admire are re-examined one by one. Courage becomes endurance in truth, rather than boldness in action. Wisdom becomes awareness of ignorance, rather than accumulation of facts. Justice becomes harmony within the soul, rather than obedience to law. Socrates dismantles without replacing, forcing Plato to live in uncertainty longer than comfort allows. This is learning as provocation, not reassurance. Plato's attachment deepens through repetition. Day after day, he listens as Socrates engages Athenians in conversations that begin casually and end uncomfortably. The pattern becomes familiar. A confident claim, a series of questions, a contradiction revealed, a silence heavy with implication. Plato learns the rhythm of inquiry, the way patience outlasts arrogance, the way honesty disarms defensiveness. He begins to sense that truth is not delivered whole, but uncovered through disciplined conversation. Yet, this education comes at a cost. Plato's peers begin to see him differently. Association with Socrates carries social risk, marking one as troublesome, unorthodox, even dangerous. Plato feels tension between loyalty to his teacher and loyalty to his class. He is learning that philosophy demands separation, not in physical distance, but in values. To question sincerely is to step outside the comfort of consensus. Socrates also challenges Plato's lingering political ambitions. When Plato speaks of reforming the city through leadership, Socrates responds not with encouragement, but with skepticism. How, he asks, can one govern others without first governing oneself? How can laws correct injustice if citizens do not understand justice? These questions do not reject politics outright, but they postpone it indefinitely, placing philosophy as a prerequisite rather than an accessory to power. Plato begins to suspect that most political failures are failures of inner order. The bond between teacher and student is not sentimental, but it is profound. Socrates does not flatter Plato, nor does he claim him as a disciple. He treats him as a fellow seeker, holding him to the same standards of honesty and rigor as everyone else. This equality deepens Plato's respect. He is not being molded into a follower, but sharpened into a thinker. The absence of hierarchy within inquiry becomes itself a lesson about justice. As Athens continues to struggle politically, Plato finds in Socrates a counter-model of citizenship. Socrates participates in the city not by holding office, but by examining its claims. He obeys the law even when it harms him, not out of submission, but out of commitment to principle. Plato sees in this stance a paradox that will haunt him. Obedience that is not endorsement, loyalty that includes criticism, love of the city expressed through discomfort. This encounter marks a turning point, not yet the lowest point, but the deepening descent into learning that precedes it. Plato is being prepared for loss even as he is gaining clarity. He does not yet know that this teacher will soon be taken from him, but the intensity of the relationship already hints at fragility. Socrates is not building an institution, not preserving his teachings in writing, not protecting himself politically. Plato begins to sense that something precious is also dangerously exposed. Through Socrates, Plato learns to value the examined life over the successful one. He learns that wisdom is not a possession, but a practice, sustained through humility and courage. He learns that the greatest threat to justice is not ignorance alone, but the refusal to admit ignorance. These lessons will later crystallize into theory, but here they exist as lived experience, shaping Plato's character more deeply than any formal education ever could. The encounter with Socrates does not give Plato answers. It gives him a method and a standard. From this point on, every belief must earn its place through examination. The city may praise him, condemn him, or ignore him, but Plato has been exposed to a way of thinking that cannot be unlearned. The descent continues, quiet and inexorable, toward the moment when philosophy will demand not just loyalty, but sacrifice. The years beside Socrates stretch quietly, without milestones that history easily marks. Yet, they become the most formative period of Plato's life. This is learning without curriculum, education without certificates, discipline without authority. Plato is trained not by instruction, but by exposure, by the daily practice of watching assumptions collapse and reform under pressure. He learns to live inside questions longer than comfort permits, to resist the temptation of premature answers, to accept uncertainty as a necessary stage of clarity. Socrates' method works through repetition and contrast. He draws the same themes again and again: justice, courage, piety, knowledge, approaching them from different angles, testing them against different lives. Plato notices the pattern. No definition survives unchanged, yet something stable emerges through the process itself. Truth is not a fixed statement, but a structure revealed through dialogue. This realization begins to separate Plato from both sophists, who sell certainty, and politicians who weaponize it. Plato learns to appreciate irony as a tool rather than a flaw. Socrates often presents himself as ignorant, not as deception, but as invitation. By lowering his own status, he encourages others to reveal theirs. Plato sees how humility disarms aggression, how patience exposes arrogance, how gentleness can be more subversive than confrontation. These techniques will later echo in Plato's dialogues, where characters speak past one another until clarity emerges not through force, but through exhaustion of error. The city continues to misunderstand Socrates, and by extension, those who follow him. Plato feels this misunderstanding sharpen. Friends warn him of reputational damage. Family members urge caution. Philosophy begins to feel like a withdrawal from practical life, a refusal to participate in accepted games of influence and ambition. Plato wrestles with this tension, questioning whether he is learning wisdom or merely escaping responsibility. Socrates offers no reassurance, only further questions. Through these years, Plato refines his sense of moral extremism and balance. He sees that Socrates refuses both excess and compromise. He will not flatter the powerful, nor will he incite rebellion. He stands in a narrow space between submission and defiance, a position that offers no protection. Plato begins to understand that virtue, practiced consistently, is often politically inconvenient. It does not bend easily to circumstance, and so it attracts hostility from all sides. This prolonged education also reveals Socrates' vulnerability, his lack of wealth, his indifference to safety, his refusal to court allies leave him exposed. Plato notices how often Socrates could protect himself by softening his tone, by choosing silence, by retreating into private life. He does not. Plato begins to sense that integrity, taken seriously, carries a cost that cannot be avoided through cleverness. Philosophy is not merely an intellectual pursuit. It is a way of being that places the practitioner at risk. At the same time, Plato's own thinking deepens in contrast. He begins to imagine how Socrates' method might be preserved, extended, or protected. The teacher seems content to let conversations vanish with the day, trusting that the impact on souls is sufficient. Plato is less certain. He starts to suspect that without structure, without continuity, wisdom is vulnerable to forgetting and distortion. This suspicion will later drive him toward writing, toward institutions, toward forms that can outlast a single life. The rhythm of daily inquiry shapes Plato's inner world. He becomes more disciplined in speech, more cautious in judgment, more resistant to easy admiration. He learns to pause before asserting, to listen before responding, to value coherence over persuasion. These habits slowly distance him from the city's dominant culture, which rewards speed, confidence, and victory. Plato is not yet isolated, but he is increasingly out of step. The descent toward the lowest point continues almost invisibly. There is no single moment of collapse yet, but the ground is being prepared. Socrates' growing unpopularity is evident. Accusations circulate quietly, then more openly. The city's patience with relentless questioning wears thin. Plato senses the tension building, the way tolerance erodes when criticism persists without offering comforting solutions. He feels an unease he cannot dispel, a premonition without clear shape. These years teach Plato that learning is not accumulation, but subtraction. Each conversation removes an illusion, a false certainty, a borrowed belief. What remains is smaller, quieter, but more durable. Plato learns that wisdom often feels like loss before it feels like gain. He is being emptied in preparation for something not yet visible. When the charge against Socrates finally emerges, It does not feel sudden to Plato. It feels like the inevitable conclusion of a long misunderstanding. He realizes that the city has never known what to do with a man who refuses to play its games. The years of learning beside Socrates have not protected Plato from this outcome. They have only made him more aware of its significance. This period ends not with triumph, but with foreboding. Plato has gained a method, a moral compass, and a sense of purpose. But he is about to lose the living embodiment of all three. The descent into humiliation and loss is almost complete. Philosophy has given him clarity, but clarity has stripped away his illusions of safety. What remains is commitment, untested by catastrophe, waiting for the moment when it will be demanded in full. Even as Socrates' shadow lengthens over his life, Plato does not abandon the idea of political action immediately. The thought returns again and again, persistent as habit, persuasive as duty. He has been raised to believe that withdrawal is failure, that those who see clearly must act publicly, that wisdom without application is a form of indulgence. For a time, Plato tries to reconcile philosophy with ambition, imagining a role for himself that does not betray either. This is not hypocrisy, but hope, the hope that understanding might still rescue the city that taught him to speak. Athens, after all, is attempting to heal. The war has ended, the 30 have fallen, democracy has been restored. There is talk of moderation, of learning from excess, of building a more stable order. Plato listens carefully. He hears language that echoes Socratic concerns, words like justice and restraint re-entering public speech. It tempts him to believe that the city is ready to listen, that the crisis has taught humility. He wonders whether philosophy might finally have its mo. For a brief period, Plato stands close to the threshold of public life. He attends assemblies not merely as an observer, but as a citizen imagining participation. He considers the possibility that law, properly informed, could guide behavior toward the good. He considers that leadership, exercised with restraint, might correct the errors of demagogues and tyrants alike. In these moments, Plato feels the pull of responsibility. He is not indifferent to the suffering of the city. He wants order, coherence, and justice, not as abstractions, but as lived realities. Yet philosophy complicates every step forward. Socratic questioning has made Plato suspicious of motives, including his own. He asks himself whether his desire to govern is driven by service or by pride, by necessity or by habit. He recognizes how easily intelligence can become justification, how easily good intentions can slide into control. These doubts do not paralyze him, but they slow him. Forcing reflect Plato also watches the restored democracy carefully, and what he sees unsettles him. The same patterns re-emerge with minor adjustments. Orators still dominate assemblies through emotional appeal. Citizens still prefer certainty to examination. Laws are still applied unevenly, softened for friends, sharpened for enemies. The language has changed, but the structure beneath it remains familiar. Plato begins to realize that political reform without moral reform is cosmetic. It rearranges power. His conversations with Socrates during this period are tense, though never confrontational. Plato speaks of obligation, of the need for wise men to lead. Socrates responds with questions that cut deeper than refusal. What is leadership without knowledge of the good? What is law without understanding of justice? What is authority without mastery of oneself? These questions do not deny political engagement outright, but they make it conditional in ways that seem almost impossible to satisfy. Plato senses that Socrates does not trust that this tension sharpens Plato's awareness of a paradox that will define his life. He believes that the city needs philosophy to survive, yet he also sees that the city resists philosophy when it threatens comfort. He begins to suspect that wisdom and power operate on different timelines. Power demands immediate results. Wisdom unfolds slowly. The city lives in urgency. Philosophy lives in patience. Trying to merge them too quickly may destroy both. Plato's aristocratic connections bring him into contact with men who have held power and lost it. He listens to their stories of compromise, of gradual concessions made in the name of pragmatism. He hears how idols are softened to maintain alliances, how silence is chosen to avoid backlash. These accounts disturb him more than outright corruption. They reveal how good intentions erode not through betrayal, but through accommodation. Plato begins to fear not failure, but success of the wrong. The dream of political action begins to change shape. It no longer appears as direct participation, but as preparation. Plato wonders whether the city's leaders fail, not because they are malicious, but because they are uneducated in the deepest sense. They know laws, strategies, and rhetoric, but they do not know themselves. They have never examined their desires, their fears, their assumptions. Plato starts to imagine education as the true foundation of politics, a slower, quieter path that reshapes the soul before it reshapes the state. This shift marks the end of a certain innocence. Plato does not renounce politics yet, but he postpones it, placing it behind philosophy rather than alongside it. He begins to see that without a disciplined inner life, public action multiplies harm. The city does not need more clever leaders. It needs better ones. And better leaders cannot be produced by ambition alone. As accusations against Socrates grow louder, Plato's hesitation hardens into caution. He watches how quickly public opinion turns against those who challenge assumptions. He sees how little protection wisdom offers when it lacks popular approval. These observations do not extinguish his sense of duty, but they redirect it. Plato starts to believe that his task may not be to rule, but to create conditions under which ruling justly may go. This section of his life ends suspended between paths. Plato has not yet suffered the final humiliation that will shatter his remaining faith in Athenian justice, but he is approaching it. The dream of political action has not died, but it has been wounded, complicated by insight, and restrained by doubt. He stands at a crossroads, still hoping that philosophy might redeem the city, still uncertain how much the city is willing to be. The descent continues, quieter now, less dramatic, but more decisive. Plato is learning that the greatest obstacles to justice are not enemies, but habits, not tyrants, but unexamined desires. This realization does not yet bring him clarity, but it prepares him for the moment when illusion will collapse entirely. The city he wishes to serve is about to teach him once more what it does to those. The day of Socrates' death does not arrive as a shock, but as a culmination, the final movement of a process Plato has watched unfold with growing dread. Still, inevitability does not soften the blow. When the verdict is carried out, it strikes with a clarity that no argument can dull. This is the lowest point of Plato's life, not because it surprises him, but because it confirms everything he feared about the city he once believed could be guided by reason. Plato is not present in the prison at the final moment. Whether by illness or circumstance, matters little to him afterward. Absence becomes another wound, one he will revisit in memory and imagination for the rest of his life. He knows the account well enough. Socrates speaks calmly, refuses escape, drinks the poison without trembling. He dies as he lived, obedient to the law, even when the law has failed him. For Plato, this obedience is not submission, but indictment. By accepting the sentence, Socrates exposes the city's injustice more completely than resistance ever could. The humiliation is layered. There is grief for the teacher, sharp and personal. There is shame for the city, public and enduring. And there is guilt, inward and corrosive. Plato had hoped for reform, imagined intervention, believed that reason might yet prevail. None of it mattered. Philosophy has not saved the philosopher. Wisdom has not protected the wise. Plato confronts the brutal reality that truth offers no immunity against power when power is afraid. In the aftermath, Athens resumes its routines with unnerving efficiency. The execution resolves a tension for the city, closes a chapter it no longer wishes to read. For Plato, it opens a wound that refuses closure. He walks the streets where Socrates once questioned passers-by, now quiet, almost relieved. The absence is louder than any accusation. Plato feels alienated in his own home, a citizen without belonging, loyal to a city that has betrayed its best self. This moment strips Plato of his last illusions about Athenian justice. He no longer believes that the law, by itself, tends toward the good. He no longer trusts public opinion as a guide to truth. The democracy that once promised wisdom through collective deliberation has revealed its limits. It can deliberate, yes, but it can also persecute. It can praise freedom and still silence those who use it too well. Plato's humiliation is not public, but it is profound. He is young, gifted, and suddenly directionless. The path toward politics collapses entirely. To enter public life now would feel like complicity, an endorsement of the very mechanisms that destroyed his teacher. Plato begins to see that participating in unjust systems without transforming them is not service, but surrender. The thought of standing before the same assemblies that condemned Socrates fills him with revulsion. For a time, Plato withdraws. He speaks little, listens less, and carries his questions inward. The Socratic practice of dialogue becomes internalized, turning his own thoughts against one another. He interrogates himself relentlessly. Why did he stay? Why did he hope? Why did he believe that intelligence alone could soften fear? These questions do not lead to comfort, but they prevent despair from hardening into bitterness. Plato refuses to hate the city, even as he acknowledges its failure. This period marks the nadir of the emotional arc. Loss is complete, faith is shattered, and the future feels hollow. Plato stands among the ruins of his assumptions, unsure what remains worth building. Philosophy, once a shared activity, now feels solitary and vulnerable. Without Socrates, the practice of inquiry seems exposed, almost orphaned. Plato fears that the method itself may die, misunderstood and unprotected. Yet, even here, something stubborn survives. The very fact that Socrates died for questioning convinces Plato that questioning matters. The city has proven, through violence, that philosophy is dangerous, and danger implies power. Plato begins to sense that if wisdom can threaten a city, then it must contain something essential, something capable of reshaping lives and institutions, if only it can be preserved. The humiliation of Socrates' death transforms into resolve, slow and deliberate. Plato's grief does not push him toward rebellion, but toward reconstruction. He begins to think not of how to confront the city, but of how to outlast it. Athens has silenced one voice, but Plato wonders whether ideas might be given a form that cannot be so easily executed. He starts to imagine philosophy not as a series of conversations vulnerable to interruption, but as a structure, a lineage, a discipline that can endure hostility. This lowest point does not end in catharsis. There is no dramatic vow, no clear plan, no immediate action. There is only a quiet turning inward, a recognition that the life he imagined for himself is no longer possible, and that a different, more demanding path must be found. Plato does not yet know where this path leads, but he knows where it cannot go. It cannot lead back into a city that kills its conscience and calls the act justice. The death of Socrates fractures Plato's world, but it also frees him from compromise. The descent has reached its bottom. From here, movement is possible again, not upward yet, but outward. Exile, whether chosen or imposed, begins to appear not as abandonment, but as necessity. To preserve philosophy, Plato may need to leave the city that taught him to love it. And so, the lowest moment becomes the threshold of transformation, the dark ground from which a new kind of life will slowly emerge. Leaving Athens is not an act of drama, but of quiet survival. Plato does not announce his departure, does not frame it as protest or exile, yet the meaning is unmistakable. The city that raised him, educated him, and executed his teacher has become unbearable. Every familiar street carries echoes of Socrates' voice, now unanswered. Every public space feels contaminated by the memory of applause that once followed condemnation. To remain would be to calcify grief into resentment. To leave is to keep philosophy alive by removing it from immediate danger. Plato's flight is inward as much as outward. He carries with him not only sorrow, but questions sharpened by loss. What is justice if the law can be unjust? What is citizenship if loyalty demands silence? What is wisdom if it cannot survive the city that claims to value it? These questions travel with him as companions, shaping his perception of every place he enters. He is no longer merely a student or a grieving disciple. He is becoming a seeker of alternatives. His first refuge is among those who share Socratic sympathies, places where conversation still breathes freely. Megara offers temporary shelter, a city less powerful, less volatile, where inquiry attracts less suspicion. Here, Plato begins to experience philosophy detached from Athenian intensity. The absence of the crowd changes the tone of thought. Without constant political urgency, reflection deepens. Plato starts to sense that philosophy may require distance from power to mature fully, yet restlessness remains. Plato is not content to hide. He feels compelled to see how other cultures approach order, knowledge, and the good life. His grief propels him forward, turning exile into exploration. Each journey becomes a comparison, each city a mirror reflecting Athens' strengths and failures in altered form. Plato is no longer searching for comfort, but for structure. As he moves beyond Greece, the world expands conceptually as well as geographically. In Egypt, Plato encounters an ancient civilization that values stability over innovation, continuity over debate. Knowledge here is preserved through ritual, measurement, and tradition. Mathematics, astronomy, and architecture are treated not as tools for persuasion, but as foundations of cosmic order. Plato is struck by the contrast. Athens thrives on argument. Egypt thrives on permanence. Neither alone seems sufficient, but together they suggest a synthesis not yet attempted. The experience alters Plato's understanding of education. He begins to imagine knowledge not merely as dialogue, but as discipline, something transmitted carefully across generations. The Egyptian emphasis on number, proportion, and harmony resonates with his growing suspicion that truth may exist beyond opinion, beyond the flux of political life. This exposure plants the early seeds of a belief that reality itself may have an underlying structure, accessible through reason rather than debate. Plato's travels also expose him to religious and mystical traditions that treat the soul as central. These beliefs do not replace Socratic ethics, but they deepen them. Plato starts to think of the soul not merely as a moral agent, but as something that can be ordered or disordered, elevated or corrupted. The idea that education shapes not just behavior, but the very orientation of desire begins to take hold. Philosophy, in this light, becomes a form of care, a therapy for the inner life. Throughout these journeys, Plato remains haunted by Socrates' death. Each new system of thought is measured against that memory. Would this culture have tolerated Socrates? Would this structure have protected him? Would this vision of order have prevented his condemnation? Often, the answer is unclear. Plato learns that no society is immune to injustice, only differently vulnerable. This realization tempers idealism without extinguishing hope. Exile also teaches Plato humility. Away from the prestige of Athens, his name carries little weight. He is no longer an aristocrat among equals, but a foreigner navigating unfamiliar customs. This loss of status reinforces Socratic lessons about the emptiness of reputation. Plato learns to listen more than speak, to observe before judging. The world becomes his teacher, and curiosity replaces certainty as his primary guide. Slowly, the emotional arc begins to rise again, though cautiously. The pain of loss remains, but it is joined by possibility. Plato starts to see that Socrates' death, while devastating, has freed him from the constraints of Athenian expectation. He is no longer preparing for a political role that does not fit him. He is free to imagine philosophy on a larger scale, detached from any single city, capable of addressing humanity rather than a single polis. This period of wandering is not aimless. Each encounter, each idea is gathered, tested, and stored. Plato is assembling raw material for something not yet formed. He does not write extensively during this time, nor does he establish a school. He is still absorbing, still learning, still descending into depth before ascent. The memory of humiliation keeps him cautious. He refuses to build too quickly, to declare conclusions before foundations are secure. Athens recedes into the background, but it never disappears. Plato's thoughts continually circle back to the city that failed Socrates. He does not abandon it emotionally, even as he leaves it physically. Instead, Athens becomes a problem to be solved, a case study in human contradiction. Plato begins to imagine returning one day, not as a politician seeking office, but as a thinker offering something the city lacks but desperately needs. Flight from Athens is thus not an ending, but a transformation. Plato sheds one identity without yet claiming another. He is no longer simply Socrates' student, but he is not yet the philosopher who will define centuries. He exists in between, suspended in motion, carrying grief as fuel rather than weight. This exile is not punishment, but preparation. By leaving the condemned city, Plato saves not only himself, but the possibility of philosophy's future. He learns that sometimes preservation requires distance, that loyalty may demand withdrawal, and that truth often survives not through confrontation, but through patience. The journey away from Athens becomes the first step upward from the lowest point, a slow ascent shaped by reflection, experience, and the unspoken promise that loss, when understood deeply enough, can become foundation. Plato's wandering settles into rhythm, and with rhythm comes a new kind of attention, no longer fleeing grief. He begins to pursue understanding deliberately, choosing destinations not for safety alone, but for what they might teach him about order. The Mediterranean world becomes a moving classroom, its cities offering contrasting answers to the same enduring questions. How should knowledge be preserved? How should power be restrained? How should the soul be shaped so that justice becomes possible at all? In southern Italy, Plato encounters communities influenced by Pythagorean thought, and here his imagination catches on something precise and demanding. These thinkers speak of number not as tool, but as principle, of harmony not as metaphor, but as structure woven into reality itself. For a man shaped by the chaos of war and the arbitrariness of political judgment, this vision is intoxicating. It suggests that beneath the noise of opinion, there exists an order untouched by fear, an architecture of being that does not vote or condemn. Plato listens carefully, cautious not to surrender to enthusiasm too quickly. The Pythagoreans live disciplined lives, governed by rules that reach into diet, behavior, and silence. Their commitment to structure impresses him. Where Athens prized freedom of speech, these communities prize restraint. Where Athens thrives on argument, they cultivate contemplation. Plato begins to wonder whether dialogue alone is sufficient, or whether wisdom also requires habits, boundaries, and shared practices that protect the mind from its own excesses. The concept of mathematics as a path to truth reshapes Plato's thinking profoundly. Numbers do not persuade, they demonstrate. They do not flatter, they compel assent through necessity. Plato sees in this a model of knowledge immune to the instability of politics. 2 plus 2 remains 4, regardless of the crowd's mood. Geometry holds even when empires fall. This permanence resonates with his growing belief that justice, too, must be grounded in something beyond opinion. Yet Plato does not abandon Socratic questioning. Instead, he begins to imagine a synthesis. Dialogue reveals ignorance. Mathematics reveals structure. Together, they might guide the soul towards stable understanding. Plato starts to suspect that Socrates' method needs reinforcement, a way to anchor inquiry so that it does not dissolve into endless skepticism. The death of Socrates has shown him the danger of a philosophy that provokes without protecting itself. Order, carefully designed, might offer that protection. These communities also deepen Plato's interest in the soul as an object of education. The Pythagorean belief in harmony between inner life and cosmic order suggests that justice is not merely social, but ontological. A just person is not simply one who obeys laws, but one whose desires are aligned correctly. This idea electrifies Plato. It reframes politics entirely. If the soul can be ordered, then the city, composed of souls, might reflect that order indirectly, without coercion. Plato's time among these thinkers is not without tension. He senses the danger of rigidity, of replacing Athenian chaos with dogmatic silence. Some Pythagorean practices strike him as excessive, their secrecy bordering on superstition. Plato learns here another lesson in balance. Structure without questioning becomes tyranny of another kind. Harmony imposed rather than understood becomes constraint rather than freedom. He absorbs what strengthens inquiry and resists what threatens it. This period marks a clear upward turn in the emotional arc. For the first time since Socrates' death, Plato feels constructive energy outweigh despair. He is building inwardly, assembling a framework capable of holding both skepticism and certainty. The humiliation of loss is not erased, but it is transmuted. Grief becomes motivation. Philosophy becomes not only resistance to injustice, but architecture against it. Plato also begins to imagine teaching in a new way, not as Socrates taught, entirely through spontaneous conversation, but through a combination of dialogue, discipline, and shared pursuit of truth. He wonders what it would mean to create a space where inquiry is protected from political reprisal, where learning unfolds slowly, insulated from the volatility of public opinion. The idea remains vague, but it persists, returning to him like a refrain. As his travels continue, Plato's sense of time changes. He stops measuring life in terms of immediate outcomes and starts thinking in generations. Cities rise and fall, but ideas, if properly formed, can outlast them. This long view eases his anger toward Athens. The city may have failed Socrates, but it cannot prevent Socrates' influence from spreading, provided someone carries it forward with care. The Mediterranean world shows Plato variety rather than resolution. No single culture holds the answer he seeks. Instead, each offers a fragment: Athenian dialogue, Egyptian permanence, Pythagorean order. Plato begins to see his task not as choosing among them, but as weaving them into something new. This act of synthesis becomes his defining talent, not invention from nothing, but construction from tension. By the end of this wandering phase, Plato is no longer merely reacting to loss. He is shaping a vision. Philosophy, he now believes, must be both critical and constructive, both questioning and ordered, both free and disciplined. The emotional ascent continues, steady but cautious. Plato is not yet ready to return home, but he is no longer running from it. He carries with him a blueprint still incomplete, but increasingly coherent, one that will soon demand a place in the world. What begins as fascination with Pythagorean order slowly sharpens into temptation. Plato feels it as a quiet pull, the allure of a world where reality obeys structure, where chaos yields to proportion, where truth can be demonstrated rather than debated. After years of political disorder and moral ambiguity, the promise of mathematical certainty feels almost salvational. Here, at last, is knowledge that does not depend on persuasion, popularity, or power. It simply is. The appeal is not merely intellectual, it is emotional. Plato has lived through the collapse of civic trust, the execution of wisdom, and the volatility of opinion. Numbers offer refuge. They do not betray. They do not forget. They do not condemn their practitioners for asking the wrong questions. In geometry, Plato senses a purity untouched by human fear. The idea that reality itself might be governed by intelligible forms begins to take root, quietly but firmly. The Pythagorean vision suggests that the universe is not accidental but ordered, and that the soul, properly trained, can align itself with this order. Plato finds this deeply consoling. It implies that justice is not merely a social agreement, vulnerable to distortion, but a reflection of deeper harmony. To live unjustly, in this view, is not simply to break a law, but to fall out of tune with reality itself. Plato feels the resonance of this idea echo against his grief for Socrates. Yet temptation carries danger. Plato is careful not to surrender inquiry to reverence. He notices how easily devotion to structure can harden into dogma. Some Pythagorean communities guard their teachings with secrecy, discouraging questions that threaten internal cohesion. Plato recognizes a familiar pattern. Where Athens silenced questioning through accusation, these groups risk silencing it through sanctity. Both, in their own way, fear disruption. Plato wrestles with this tension. He wants order, but not at the cost of freedom. He wants certainty, but not at the price of honesty. He begins to see that structure without dialogue becomes rigid, and dialogue without structure becomes unstable. The temptation, then, is not simply mathematical, but philosophical. Will he replace Socratic questioning with numerical authority, trading one form of vulnerability for another kind of safety? This internal struggle refines his thinking. Plato starts to imagine forms not as numbers alone, but as intelligible realities grasped through reason. Mathematics becomes a guide rather than a master, a training ground for the mind rather than a final destination. It teaches the soul to think beyond appearances, to recognize patterns that persist beneath change. But it does not answer moral questions by itself. Plato senses that justice cannot be calculated like an equation, even if it reflects an underlying order. The temptation also reshapes Plato's view of education. He begins to believe that the mind must be trained gradually, moving from concrete perception to abstract understanding. Mathematics, with its demand for precision and patience, becomes a preparatory discipline, a way of disciplining desire and attention. This insight will later become central to his vision of learning. But here, it exists as intuition, forming quietly at the edge of experience. Plato's resistance to full conversion is itself Socratic. He remembers that Socrates distrusted any claim to final knowledge. The teacher's insistence on examination acts as a counterweight, preventing Plato from mistaking structure for truth itself. He learns to hold the Pythagorean vision in tension, valuing its clarity while resisting its exclusivity. Philosophy, he concludes, must remain open, even when it seeks order. This period strengthens Plato's constructive impulse. He is no longer content to react against injustice or chaos. He wants to build a framework capable of sustaining inquiry without collapsing under pressure. The idea of invisible forms begins to crystallize, not yet as doctrine, but as orientation. Reality, Plato suspects, has layers, and the visible world is only the surface expression of deeper, intelligible patterns. Emotionally, this is a moment of rising confidence tempered by caution. Plato feels closer to an answer, but he refuses to declare victory. The temptation to settle, to claim certainty, is strong. Yet he remembers where premature confidence leads. Athens believed it knew what was best. The Pythagoreans believe they know the structure of all things. Plato positions himself between these extremes, seeking a path that honors order without extinguishing doubt. By the end of this phase, Plato has absorbed what he needs without surrendering his independence. The temptation has strengthened rather than captured him. He leaves with a sharper sense of what philosophy might become, a discipline that unites dialogue and demonstration, ethics and metaphysics, freedom and form. The ascent continues, no longer driven solely by grief, but by vision. This synthesis prepares Plato for his next confrontation, not with abstract ideas, but with power itself. The question he now carries forward is no longer only how truth is known, but whether truth can survive proximity to authority. The next stage of his life will test this question brutally, as philosophy steps out of contemplation and into the shadow of tyranny. Plato's return from wandering does not bring him back to Athens immediately, but it does bring him closer to power. The invitation comes from Sicily, from the court of Syracuse, a city rich, ambitious, and ruled by men who believe themselves capable of being shaped by philosophy. For Plato, this moment feels like a test offered by history itself. If wisdom is ever to guide authority, surely it must be tried where authority is strongest. The memory of Socrates urges caution. Yet the hope of redemption presses forward. Syracuse is unlike Athens in tone and temperament. Where Athens argues, Syracuse commands. Where Athens persuades, Syracuse enforces. Power here is centralized, embodied in the tyrant Dionysius, whose rule is maintained through fear as much as loyalty. Plato arrives not as a teacher addressing equals, but as a guest navigating hierarchy. The shift is immediate and disorienting. Conversation here does not unfold freely. It must be weighed against consequence. At first, the experiment seems possible. Plato speaks of justice, moderation, and self-mastery, ideas that intrigue those close to power, especially Dion, a relative of the ruler and a man genuinely drawn to philosophy. Dion believes, with youthful intensity, that wisdom can transform tyranny into lawful rule. He sees in Plato not a threat, but a guide. For a time, Plato allows himself to believe the same. The ascent of his life seems to accelerate, rising toward the possibility that philosophy might finally reshape the world beyond words. Plato's teachings, however, carry an edge that power does not easily tolerate. He speaks not of flattery, but of restraint, not of conquest, but of harmony. He suggests that true authority begins with governance of the self, that a ruler enslaved to desire cannot be free, no matter how vast his dominion. These ideas land unevenly. Dion listens, Others bristle. Dionysius listens, but listens selectively, hearing affirmation where Plato intends critique. The court becomes a stage of subtle tension. Plato senses that philosophy, when placed too close to authority, is quickly repurposed. Words meant to challenge become ornaments of legitimacy. Plato sees how easily ideas are absorbed without being obeyed, quoted without being lived. The tyrant enjoys the language of wisdom, but resists its demands. Plato begins to understand that power prefers philosophy as decoration, not as discipline. As Plato presses further, the atmosphere hardens. What once felt like curiosity begins to feel like threat. A ruler who tolerates questioning does so only until the questioning touches his own habits. Plato's insistence on moral transformation exposes vulnerabilities Dionysius would rather conceal. Philosophy, once welcomed, becomes inconvenient. The court whispers. Alliances shift. Plato feels the familiar chill of danger, the same chill he felt in Athens when Socrates' questions grew too sharp. This confrontation forces Plato to confront a painful truth. Philosophy does not merely fail to persuade power, it often provokes it. The very clarity that makes wisdom valuable makes it intolerable to those invested in control. Plato recognizes that the problem is not ignorance, but resistance. The tyrant does not misunderstand philosophy. He rejects its implications. This realization wounds Plato deeply because it echoes the fate of Socrates in a new form. Emotionally, this moment sits high on the arc, charged with possibility and tension. Plato has dared to test his vision against reality, to bring philosophy out of exile and into the center of rule. The attempt itself feels like victory, regardless of outcome. He has not retreated into abstraction. He has confronted power directly, armed only with ideas. Yet beneath this pride runs fear, the knowledge that such confrontation rarely ends well. Plato begins to sense that the experiment is failing. The structure of tyranny resists internal reform. Advice becomes surveillance. Dialogue becomes liability. Dion's position grows precarious as well, caught between loyalty to Plato and loyalty to his ruler. Plato watches the cost of philosophical proximity to power rise, measured not in argument, but in lives and futures. The warning of Socrates returns with renewed force. This encounter does not yet end in catastrophe, but the trajectory is clear. Plato has tested the dream of the philosopher advising the ruler, and the result is ambiguity at best, danger at worst. He learns that philosophy cannot simply be inserted into power like a corrective mechanism. Power must desire transformation, not merely tolerate it. Without that desire, wisdom becomes a threat rather than a guide. As Plato prepares to leave Syracuse, he carries conflicting emotions. There is disappointment, sharp and personal, at the failure of hope. There is anger, restrained but real, at the misuse of philosophy. And there is a deeper clarity forming, one that will reshape his life's work. If philosophy is to influence politics, it may need to do so indirectly, by shaping those who will one day hold power. Rather than advising those who already do, the ascent pauses here, not collapsing, but recalibrating. Plato has glimpsed what victory might look like and what it costs to pursue it. The question now is not whether philosophy can rule, but how it can survive without being corrupted or destroyed. The answer will not be found in courts or palaces, but in foundations yet to be laid. in spaces where inquiry is protected from both fear and flattery. The unraveling in Syracuse is not swift, but it is decisive. What began as cautious optimism curdles into suspicion, and suspicion hardens into punishment. Plato learns, again, that proximity to power is not a neutral position. It reshapes the meaning of words, distorts intentions, and magnifies risk. The court that once welcomed him as a philosopher now studies him as a liability. Ideas that promised reform are reinterpreted as subversion. Silence, once a courtesy, becomes a demand. The break comes without drama. There is no public debate, no formal accusation, only a tightening of circumstance. Plato's access narrows. Conversations end abruptly. Faces that once nodded now look past him. Dion's influence wanes, and with it, the fragile shield that protected Plato from consequence. The tyrant's tolerance has reached its limit. Philosophy has crossed from ornament to threat. Plato is dismissed, but not released. The humiliation that follows is total and instructive. He is detained, stripped of status, and treated not as a guest, but as cargo. The journey home becomes a descent into vulnerability, one that forces Plato to confront the naked reality of power, unrestrained by law. At the port, amid the noise of trade and indifference, Plato is handed over, sold into bondage as casually as one might exchange a commodity. The philosopher who sought to advise rulers finds himself owned by them. This is the second low point of his life, distinct from the death of Socrates, but equally formative. If Athens taught Plato that the law can be unjust, Syracuse teaches him that power can be lawless. There is no pretense of civic virtue here, no appeal to democratic judgment. Force operates openly, without apology. Plato feels the humiliation not only in his body, but in his vision of philosophy itself. Wisdom has not merely failed to rule. It has been punished for trying. The experience compresses time. Fear sharpens perception. Plato observes the mechanics of domination up close, the way men accustomed to command no longer see those beneath them as moral equals. He recognizes how easily a life can be reduced to utility, how quickly dignity evaporates when it is no longer protected by custom or reputation. These observations are not abstract. They are lived, immediate, and unforgiving. Plato is eventually ransomed, rescued by those who still value him. But rescue does not erase the lesson. He carries the memory of that moment like a scar. The philosopher king ideal, once tentative hope, now appears dangerous if misunderstood. Plato sees clearly that wisdom cannot be imposed upon power from outside, and that power, when threatened, will not hesitate to crush the hand that offers counsel. This humiliation recalibrates Plato's ambition. He does not abandon the dream of aligning philosophy and rule, but he radically rethinks the method. The court has taught him what the city taught Socrates in another way. Ideas that challenge authority must be protected before they are deployed. Philosophy must have a home strong enough to withstand retaliation, independent enough to survive displeasure, patient enough to work across generations rather than regimes. Emotionally, Plato emerges sobered, not embittered. He resists the temptation to retreat into cynicism. Instead, he studies the pattern revealed by his own suffering. Power resists examination because examination exposes contingency. Tyranny depends on inevitability, the illusion that things must be as they are. Philosophy dissolves that illusion. and so it is treated as threat. Plato accepts this not as tragedy, but as fact. He also confronts his own naivety. He had believed that clarity alone could persuade, that rational argument might disarm fear. Syracuse disabuses him of this belief. Fear does not yield to logic, it reacts to it. Plato learns that education must precede authority, not follow it. Rulers shaped by power are unlikely to accept limits. Limits must be internalized before power is acquired. This moment marks the end of Plato's experiments with courts and tyrants. He does not renounce engagement with politics, but he renounces improvisation. No more ad hoc advising, no more reliance on goodwill. If philosophy is to endure, it must be institutionalized, given structure without surrendering freedom, protected without becoming dogma. The humiliation at Syracuse clarifies this necessity with brutal efficiency. As Plato returns to Greece, poorer in possessions, but richer in understanding, the emotional arc begins to rise again, slowly and deliberately. He has lost illusions, not purpose. He has learned the cost of proximity to power, and in learning it, he has gained the resolve to build something stronger than influence. The philosopher who once imagined reforming rulers now imagines forming minds. Socrates' death taught Plato that cities fear questioning. Syracuse teaches him that rulers fear it even more. Between these two lessons, a path emerges. Philosophy must be cultivated away from immediate power, in spaces where inquiry is protected, where discipline tempers freedom, and where the soul is trained long before it is entrusted with command. This insight does not yet have a name, but it has momentum. The humiliation at the court does not end Plato's engagement with the world. It deepens it. He returns not as a broken man, but as a chastened builder. The lowest point has passed. From here, the ascent will not be dramatic, but durable. Plato has learned what happens when philosophy stands naked before power. The rest of his life will be devoted to ensuring it never has to stand alone again. When Plato finally returns to Athens, the city greets him without ceremony. There are no accusations this time, no honors either. Athens has moved on, as cities always do, absorbing events into memory and smoothing their edges. For Plato, the familiarity is unsettling. The streets are the same, the temples unchanged. Yet he is not the man who left. He returns wiser, wounded, and resolved, carrying experiences that have stripped him of illusion and replaced it with purpose. Athens now feels smaller, not in size, but in ambition. The political noise that once demanded his attention no longer commands his allegiance. He sees it with clarity, sharpened by distance. The assemblies still argue, the courts still judge, the rhetoric still dazzles. But Plato understands now that participation without preparation leads only to repetition of failure. The city has not learned what Socrates tried to teach it. Plato will not try to teach the city directly again. Instead, he turns inward and outward at once, focusing on construction rather than confrontation. The idea that has been forming through grief, exile, temptation, and humiliation now presses toward reality. Philosophy needs a place, not a court, not an assembly, not a private circle vulnerable to suspicion, but a stable ground where inquiry can endure without bending to power or fear. Plato begins to imagine such a place, not as refuge, but as foundation. The land he chooses lies just outside the city walls, in a grove once associated with the hero Academus. The location is symbolic without being defiant. It is close enough to Athens to engage with its life, yet distant enough to remain independent of its turbulence. Here, Plato sees the possibility of balance, proximity without submission, influence without exposure. The choice reflects everything he has learned. Philosophy must neither isolate itself completely nor surrender itself to the city's demands. The founding of the academy is not announced as a revolution. It grows gradually, almost quietly, through conversation, shared study, and deliberate discipline. Plato does not present himself as a master dispensing doctrine. He remains, in spirit, a student of Socrates, insisting that inquiry remains central. Yet, unlike Socrates, he builds structure around inquiry, creating continuity where there was once only momentary exchange. This is philosophy made durable. The academy reflects synthesis. Dialogue remains its heartbeat, but mathematics shapes its spine. Students are trained not merely to argue, but to think with precision, to endure abstraction, to resist the seductions of rhetoric unsupported by structure. Geometry and arithmetic are not ends in themselves, but preparations, disciplines that steady the mind and align attention toward what does not change. Plato believes that only such training can protect inquiry from degeneration into opinion. Plato's role within the academy is careful and restrained. He guides without commanding, questions without humiliating, teaches without simplifying. He understands now the danger of authority unchecked, even philosophical authority. The academy is not a cult, not a school of dogma, but a community bound by shared pursuit rather than shared conclusions. Plato allows disagreement, even confusion, believing that enforced clarity produces only imitation. Emotionally, this period marks a high point of building. For the first time since Socrates' death, Plato feels alignment between purpose and action. He is no longer reacting against loss or humiliation. He is constructing something positive, something that embodies his convictions rather than merely opposing their violations. The academy becomes a living answer to the question that haunted him in exile. How can philosophy survive in a world that fears it? By giving it roots deeper than any single life. Athens watches with mild curiosity. Some dismiss the academy as impractical, others as elitist, still others as harmless eccentricity. Plato does not correct them. He has learned that philosophy thrives best when underestimated. The academy does not seek mass appeal. It seeks depth. Its influence is quiet, spreading not through decrees, but through minds shaped slowly over years. Plato also begins to write in earnest during this time, not treatises, but dialogues. This choice is deliberate. He refuses to replace living inquiry with static proclamation. The dialogue form preserves the movement of thought, the tension between positions, the refusal of easy resolution. Through writing, Plato protects Socrates' voice, extending his teacher's method beyond death without embalming it. The written word becomes both memory and invitation. The academy attracts students from across the Greek world, drawn not by promises of power, but by the discipline of thought it offers. Plato watches carefully, aware that among these young minds may be future leaders, legislators, and rulers. He does not instruct them how to seize power. He trains them how to examine themselves. The hope is indirect but deliberate. If rulers are ever to be just, they must be formed before ambition hardens them. This return to Athens is not reconciliation, but redefinition. Plato no longer seeks the city's approval, nor does he condemn it outright. He accepts its limitations and works around them. The academy stands as quiet critique, a reminder that another way of life is possible, one governed not by applause or fear, but by reason, disciplined through humility. The emotional arc rises steadily here, grounded rather than triumphant. Plato has learned to distrust dramatic victories. He values endurance more than conquest. The academy is not immune to challenge, but it is resilient by design. It does not depend on a single ruler's favor or a single generation's enthusiasm. It is meant to outlast him. In founding the academy, Plato transforms personal failure into institutional strength. Socrates' death, his own humiliation, the corruption of power, all are absorbed into a structure that anticipates hostility without being defined by it. Philosophy, once vulnerable and exposed, now has shelter without surrender. Plato has not solved the city's problems, but he has created a place where those problems can be understood deeply enough to be addressed someday. The builder has replaced the exile. The teacher has replaced the disappointed citizen. Plato settles into this role, not with complacency, but with vigilance, aware that institutions, like cities, can decay if not constantly examined. Yet for now, the foundation holds. The ascent continues, not upward toward power, but outward toward legacy. With the academy established, Plato's energy turns inward again, this time not toward withdrawal, but toward articulation. Building a place for philosophy is only the first task. Filling it with living thought is the harder one. The years that follow are marked by sustained intellectual labor, quieter than travel or humiliation, yet no less demanding. Plato begins to shape ideas, not merely through conversation, but through carefully crafted dialogues that extend inquiry beyond the grove and into the future. Writing, for Plato, is an act of tension. He mistrusts it even as he relies upon it. Words fixed on a page cannot answer back, cannot adapt to the soul of the listener, cannot correct misunderstanding in real time. And yet, Plato has learned what happens when philosophy exists only in fragile, spoken form. Socrates' voice was silenced because it lived entirely in the moment. Plato resolves to preserve that voice without betraying its spirit. The dialogue becomes his solution, a written form that refuses to behave like doctrine. In these works, Plato stages inquiry as drama. Characters speak, err, contradict themselves, and change. No single voice dominates unquestioned. Even Socrates, though often central, is not presented as infallible authority, but as catalyst. Plato understands that philosophy thrives on movement, not conclusions. By refusing to state his views outright, he forces the reader into participation, reenacting the very process that once unfolded in Athenian streets. This choice reflects Plato's deepest conviction. Truth, he believes, cannot simply be transmitted. It must be awakened. The soul must be led step by step, from confusion to clarity, from appearance to understanding. The dialogues are designed to do this work slowly, patiently, often frustratingly. They unsettle before they instruct. They remove certainty before offering structure. Plato has learned that education which flatters comprehension produces obedience, not wisdom. As the dialogues multiply, themes recur and deepen. Justice is no longer merely obedience to law, but harmony within the soul. Knowledge is no longer information, but recollection, a turning towards something already present but obscured. Reality itself appears layered, with visible things pointing beyond themselves toward intelligible forms that give them meaning. These ideas do not arrive fully formed. They emerge gradually, refined through repetition and contrast, shaped by years of reflection and teaching. Plato's life at the academy is disciplined and restrained. He teaches, listens, revises, and questions, resisting the temptation to crystallize his thought into final pronouncements. Students come and go, some staying for years, others passing briefly through. Plato watches them carefully, aware that influence is unpredictable. A single conversation may matter more than a decade of instruction. He has learned not to measure success by immediate results. Emotionally, this period carries a sense of earned stability. The violent lows of the past have receded, but they have not been forgotten. Plato's writing is haunted by memory, by the trial of Socrates, by the court of Syracuse, by the failures of cities and rulers. These experiences lend gravity to his abstractions. His philosophy is not escapist. It is forged in confrontation with injustice and refined through restraint. Yet there is also a softening here. Plato's language grows more expansive, more symbolic. Myths and metaphors appear, not as retreat from reason, but as companions to it. He understands that some truths resist direct statement, that the soul sometimes needs images to orient itself toward what cannot be seen. The famous images of ascent, light, and awakening are born of this recognition. Plato is no longer concerned with winning arguments. He is concerned with shaping vision. The academy itself reflects this maturation. It becomes less a response to trauma and more a center of sustained inquiry. Plato no longer feels the urgency to prove philosophy's worth through confrontation with power. He trusts now in its long reach. Ideas planted carefully will grow in minds he may never meet. This trust marks a shift from reactive ambition to generative patience. This stage of Plato's life corresponds to the high of philosophical building, not dramatic, but profound. He has created a system capable of outlasting him, not because it is rigid, but because it invites continual renewal. The dialogues do not close inquiry. They open it again and again. The academy does not enforce conclusions. It cultivates habits of thought. Plato begins to sense his own limits. He does not expect to see the political transformation he once imagined. He accepts that philosophy's influence may be indirect, delayed, and often misunderstood. This acceptance is not resignation, it is clarity. He has learned to work with time rather than against it. In these years, Plato becomes less a critic of Athens and more a philosopher of humanity. His questions expand beyond any single city, addressing conditions shared by all political communities. How desire shapes action, how ignorance masquerades as certainty, how education can elevate or corrupt. These themes give his work a universality that outlives its immediate context. The academy hums quietly as Plato writes, teaches, and listens. No armies march, no verdicts are pronounced, Yet something enduring is being constructed, line by line, conversation by conversation. Plato has turned suffering into structure, loss into legacy in progress. The ascent is no longer fragile. It rests on foundations tested by failure. As this phase draws on, a sense of completion begins to form, not of finality, but of coherence. Plato's life, once scattered by crisis and exile, now holds together around a single purpose. Philosophy has found its home, not in power or isolation, but in disciplined community and enduring inquiry. What remains ahead will test this achievement. But for now, the builder rests within his work, aware that the most difficult construction is already behind him. The work of writing continues, but its tone darkens. Beneath the steady rhythm of teaching and dialogue, Plato begins to feel the weight of years press more heavily upon him. Time, which once felt like an ally, now reveals its cost. Friends age, students depart, and the circle that once felt endlessly renewable shows its limits. Philosophy remains luminous, but life itself grows more fragile. And Plato learns that even builders must contend with erosion. Loss enters quietly. Members of his family pass without ceremony, their deaths absorbed into the ordinary flow of Athenian life. These are not public tragedies, but private diminutions, the kind that do not change history, yet alter the shape of a man's inner world. Plato feels the thinning of continuity, the realization that lineage, once so central to his identity, now recedes in importance. Blood ties loosen as intellectual inheritance takes precedence. The shift is not cold, it is clarifying. His own health begins to falter in subtle ways. Strength wanes, recovery slows, and the body reminds him that it is not governed by reason alone. Plato, who has spent years thinking about the soul's relation to order, now confronts disorder from within. This experience tempers abstraction with humility. He understands more acutely that philosophy does not eliminate suffering. It teaches how to endure it without surrendering coherence. These personal lows seep into his writing. The dialogues grow more reflective, more concerned with the shadows cast by ignorance, desire, and mortality. Plato writes not as a triumphant system builder, but as a man aware of limits. He explores the tension between the eternal and the perishable, between the intelligible forms and the bodies that glimpse them only briefly. The shadows are no longer merely political, they are existential. The famous images of confinement and ascent take on new resonance. Plato's reflections on illusion, imprisonment, and awakening are informed not only by the failures of cities, but by the body's betrayals and time's insistence. He recognizes that human beings live between worlds, capable of glimpsing truth, yet bound to conditions that resist it. This recognition softens his tone without weakening his convictions. Within the academy, Plato becomes more withdrawn, though not disengaged. He speaks less, listens more, and allows others to carry discussions forward. Authority recedes naturally as presence deepens. Students notice the change. Plato no longer presses arguments to their breaking point. He lets questions linger, trusting the process he has already set in motion. Teaching becomes an act of stewardship rather than assertion. Emotionally, this phase corresponds to a low that is quieter than humiliation, but more pervasive. There is no single catastrophe, only accumulation. Plato feels the ache of finitude, the awareness that even the most carefully constructed life cannot escape decay. Yet this low does not undo him. It refines him. Philosophy, once forged against injustice, is now tempered by mortality. He begins to speak more openly about care of the soul, not as conquest, but as maintenance. Virtue, he suggests, is not a final state, but a practice sustained against entropy. This language resonates with students who sense the seriousness beneath his calm. Plato's authority now derives less from brilliance and more from endurance. Writing, during this period, becomes an act of preservation against forgetting, not only of ideas, but of a way of life. Plato is aware that memory fades and institutions drift. The dialogues are shaped to resist this drift, embedding questions so deeply that they reactivate themselves in new minds. He writes for readers he will never meet, across distances he cannot imagine, trusting that clarity, once planted, can survive neglect. The low of age and loss does not collapse the arc, it deepens it. Plato accepts vulnerability as part of the human condition his philosophy addresses. He no longer seeks to escape the body through thought, but to integrate its limits into understanding. The result is a gentler severity, a firmness without harshness, a wisdom that does not deny pain, but places it within a larger order. Plato stands, not diminished, but clarified. The shadows he writes against are no longer only those cast by ignorance and power, but those cast by time itself. Philosophy does not banish them. It teaches how to walk within them without losing direction. The ascent that will follow is not toward dominance or innovation, but toward completion, acceptance, and the quiet transmission of what has been learned. The work of writing continues, but its tone darkens. Beneath the steady rhythm of teaching and dialogue, Plato begins to feel the weight of years press more heavily upon him. Time, which once felt like an ally, now reveals its cost. Friends age, students depart, and the circle that once felt endlessly renewable shows its limits. Philosophy remains luminous, but life itself grows more fragile. And Plato learns that even builders must contend with erosion. Loss enters quietly. Members of his family pass without ceremony, their deaths absorbed into the ordinary flow of Athenian life. These are not public tragedies, but private diminutions, the kind that do not change history, yet alter the shape of a man's inner world. Plato feels the thinning of continuity, the realization that lineage, once so central to his identity, now recedes in importance. Blood dies loosen as intellectual inheritance takes precedence. The shift is not cold, it is clarifying. His own health begins to falter in subtle ways. Strength wanes, recovery slows, and the body reminds him that it is not governed by reason alone. Plato, who has spent years thinking about the soul's relation to order, now confronts disorder from within. This experience tempers abstraction with humility. He understands more acutely that philosophy does not eliminate suffering. It teaches how to endure it without surrendering coherence. These personal lows seep into his writing. The dialogues grow more reflective, more concerned with the shadows cast by ignorance, desire, and mortality. Plato writes not as a triumphant system builder, but as a man aware of limits. He explores the tension between the eternal and the perishable, between the intelligible forms and the bodies that glimpse them only briefly. The shadows are no longer merely political, they are existential. the famous images of confinement and ascent take on new resonance. Plato's reflections on illusion, imprisonment, and awakening are informed not only by the failures of cities, but by the body's betrayals and time's insistence. He recognizes that human beings live between worlds, capable of glimpsing truth, yet bound to conditions that resist it. This recognition softens his tone without weakening his convictions. Within the academy, Plato becomes more withdrawn, though not disengaged. He speaks less, listens more, and allows others to carry discussions forward. Authority recedes naturally as presence deepens. Students notice the change. Plato no longer presses arguments to their breaking point. He lets questions linger, trusting the process he has already set in motion. Teaching becomes an act of stewardship rather than assertion. Emotionally, this phase corresponds to a low that is quieter than humiliation but more pervasive. There is no single catastrophe, only accumulation. Plato feels the ache of finitude, the awareness that even the most carefully constructed life cannot escape decay. Yet this low does not undo him. It refines him. Philosophy, once forged against injustice, is now tempered by mortality. He begins to speak more openly about care of the soul, not as conquest, but as maintenance. Virtue, he suggests, is not a final state, but a practice sustained against entropy. This language resonates with students who sense the seriousness beneath his calm. Plato's authority now derives less from brilliance and more from endurance. Writing during this period becomes an act of preservation against forgetting, not only of ideas, but of a way of life. Plato is aware that memory fades and institutions drift. The dialogues are shaped to resist this drift, embedding questions so deeply that they reactivate themselves in new minds. He writes for readers he will never meet, across distances he cannot imagine, trusting that clarity, once planted, can survive neglect. The low of age and loss does not collapse the arc, it deepens it. Plato accepts vulnerability as part of the human condition his philosophy addresses. He no longer seeks to escape the body through thought, but to integrate its limits into understanding. The result is a gentler severity, a firmness without harshness, a wisdom that does not deny pain, but places it within a larger order. As this section closes, Plato stands not diminished, but clarified. The shadows he writes against are no longer only those cast by ignorance and power, but those cast by time itself. Philosophy does not banish them. It teaches how to walk within them without losing direction. The ascent that will follow is not toward dominance or innovation, but toward completion, acceptance, and the quiet transmission of what has been learned. The bull of Sicily returns one final time, not as hope, but as obligation. Plato does not go back because he believes power has changed, but because he believes responsibility endures even after disappointment. The memory of Dion, still committed to the possibility of reform, weighs on him. Age has taught Plato restraint, not indifference. When he hears that circumstances in Syracuse have shifted again, that a new opening may exist, he faces the question he has spent a lifetime refining. Does wisdom withdraw after being wounded? Or does it return with clearer limits? Plato travels knowing what is at stake. This is not the daring optimism of his first journey, nor the humiliation of the second. It is something harder, a sober willingness to act without illusion. He understands now that philosophy cannot redeem tyranny, but it can still test it. The journey is slower, physically and emotionally. Each step carries the weight of memory. He is not chasing victory, he is measuring possibility. Syracuse greets him with familiarity stripped of warmth. The court has changed faces, but not nature. Power still concentrates, suspicion still simmers, and philosophy still occupies an uneasy place. Dionysius the Younger shows interest in Plato's ideas, but interest without discipline. Plato recognizes the pattern immediately. Curiosity replaces commitment. Admiration substitutes for effort. Plato no longer mistakes this for readiness. Yet he stays. He speaks carefully, choosing limits over confrontation. He does not demand transformation. He describes conditions. A ruler, he explains, must undergo long training, must submit desire to reason, must accept limits before exercising command. These are not instructions easily absorbed by someone already crowned. Plato senses resistance beneath polite attention. The familiar refusal dressed in civility. The tragedy unfolds not through betrayal of Plato, but through the fate of Dion. Dion attempts reform with sincerity, but sincerity proves insufficient against entrenched power. His efforts provoke fear, and fear seeks elimination. Plato watches events accelerate beyond his influence, the machinery of dominance reasserting itself. The philosopher has returned, but philosophy cannot halt momentum already set in motion. This final failure does not break Plato. It confirms what he already knows. Reform imposed late is brittle. Wisdom introduced after power consolidates is treated as threat. Plato does not flee in humiliation this time. He withdraws with clarity. He has given what he can without compromising what he is. The difference matters. Emotionally, this section carries a strange elevation. There is loss, but no despair. There is failure, but no confusion. Plato has confronted the ultimate challenge of his life, not whether philosophy can rule, but whether it can remain itself when offered proximity to power one last time. It can, if it knows when to step back. Plato leaves Syracuse for the final time, with no expectation of return. The experiment is complete. The philosopher king ideal survives, but only as standard and warning, not as immediate program. Plato understands now that his task was never to make rulers wise, but to make wisdom available to those capable of receiving it before ambition calcifies them. As the ship carries him away, Plato reflects not on what failed, but on what endured. He did not flatter tyranny. He did not surrender inquiry. He did not repeat the naivety of youth. He has learned the rhythm of engagement and withdrawal, the balance between courage and preservation. This knowledge feels like culmination. The emotional arc crests again, quieter than triumph, deeper than satisfaction. Plato has tested philosophy against every force that threatened it. Democracy condemned it. Tyranny enslaved it. Temptation nearly distorted it. And still it stands, not victorious in the way empires are victorious, but intact. This final return to Syracuse clarifies the shape of Plato's legacy. He is not the man who ruled, nor the man who advised rulers successfully. He is the man who understood why both were so difficult. That understanding, earned through repeated failure, is itself a form of success. With this last journey behind him, Plato turns fully toward home, toward teaching, writing, and preparing for departure of another kind. The ultimate challenge has been met not by force, but by fidelity. Philosophy has passed its final trial. After Syracuse fades into distance for the last time, Plato's life narrows in geography, but widens in perspective. Travel no longer tempts him. The sea, once a path towards possibility, now feels like repetition. What remains to be done lies not across water, but within the circle he has already drawn. The academy becomes the center of gravity, not because it shelters him, but because it gathers what he has learned into living continuity. Plato's days take on a measured rhythm: teaching, walking, listening, writing, resting. There is no urgency left to prove philosophy's relevance to power. He has already tested that question to exhaustion. Instead, he turns his attention to refinement. He revisits earlier ideas, not to abandon them, but to soften their edges, to remove what experience has shown to be too sharp, too confident, too easily misunderstood. Wisdom, he now believes, must grow gentler if it is to endure. The academy itself reflects this maturity. Disputes still arise, but Plato no longer intervenes quickly. He allows disagreement to stretch, trusting that struggle clarifies more than resolution. Younger thinkers push boundaries, sometimes misreading his ideas, sometimes improving upon them. Plato watches without anxiety. He has learned that control is not preservation. Influence, to survive, must tolerate mutation. This period is marked by the quiet transmission of responsibility. Plato begins to lean on trusted students, allowing them to guide discussions, organize study, and challenge one another without his presence. Among them is Aristotle, sharp, restless, and analytical, a mind both kindred and divergent. Plato recognizes in him not a replica, but a continuation of inquiry in a new direction. This recognition brings satisfaction rather than threat. Philosophy was never meant to reproduce sameness. Emotionally, this stage corresponds to settling rather than ascent or descent. The storms of earlier life have passed. What remains is weathered calm. Plato does not romanticize old age. He feels its limits clearly, yet those limits bring proportion. He speaks less of transformation and more of alignment, less of ideal cities and more of ordered souls. His thought turns increasingly toward how philosophy accompanies a human life from beginning to end. Mortality becomes less abstract. Plato senses his own finitude not as interruption, but as closure. He reflects on the soul's relation to time, on what it means to participate briefly in a reality that seems larger and more enduring than any individual life. These reflections are not anxious. They are measured, shaped by decades of confronting loss, injustice, and failure without surrender. The Academy's grove becomes a place of memory as much as inquiry. Plato recalls Socrates not with grief now, but with gratitude. The teacher's voice lives on, not as echo, but as method embedded in practice. Plato understands that he has not preserved Socrates by imitation, but by extension. Inquiry continues because it has been given form without being fixed. Athens, too, recedes into context. Plato no longer defines himself in opposition to the city. Its flaws remain, but they no longer dominate his thought. He sees Athens as one example among many of human contradiction, capable of beauty and cruelty in equal measure. This perspective frees him from bitterness. Judgment yields to comprehension. The emotional rhythm softens here, easing toward rest. Plato's language grows more patient, his metaphors more spacious. The sharp contrasts of earlier work give way to balance. He speaks of measure, of harmony, of the necessity of accepting imperfection without surrendering aspiration. Philosophy, at this stage, is not a weapon or a blueprint. It is a companion. Plato's confidence now rests not in outcomes, but in continuity. He does not know how his work will be received by future generations, nor does he attempt to guide that reception. He trusts the form he has chosen, dialogue and disciplined community, to carry inquiry forward even through misunderstanding. This trust is the final fruit of his long struggle with control, power, and fear. As days shorten and strength wanes further, Plato experiences a sense of completion not tied to accomplishment, but to coherence. His life, once fractured by crisis and exile, now feels whole. Each phase has answered the one before it. Each loss has prepared the ground for something durable. The question posed at the beginning of his life, how wisdom survives in a hostile world, has found its answer not in triumph, but in persistence. This settling down is not withdrawal from thought, but release from urgency. Plato no longer feels compelled to add, only to clarify when asked. Silence becomes as meaningful as speech. Presence replaces argument. The academy hums on, independent of his voice. The story moves gently now, preparing for its final turn. Plato has built, tested, failed, rebuilt, and entrusted. What remains is not invention, but legacy taking shape in real time. The philosopher who once stood in a courtroom watching his city condemn wisdom now stands in a garden watching wisdom pass quietly from one generation to the next. The arc eases downward toward rest, not toward obscurity, but toward endurance. Plato does not seek immortality through monuments or rule. He has chosen a subtler path. His life settles into its final phase with the calm certainty that what mattered most has already been set in motion. As Plato's strength continues to fade, his attention shifts almost entirely to those who will remain after him. Teaching, once an act of formation, becomes an act of release. He understands now that legacy is not control over the future, but preparation for it. The academy no longer depends on his presence to function, and this realization brings relief rather than anxiety. What he built has learned to stand without him. He watches his students carefully, not to judge them, but to understand how philosophy changes as it passes through different minds. Some cling closely to his ideas, others push against them, questioning premises he once defended. Plato does not resist this divergence. He recognizes it as the sign of health. A philosophy that cannot be challenged is already dead. Continuity, he now believes, lies in method, not in conclusion. Among these students, Aristotle stands out, not as successor, but as counterweight. Where Plato is drawn toward synthesis and symbol, Aristotle leans toward analysis and classification. Their differences are obvious, sometimes sharp, yet Plato welcomes them. He sees in Aristotle proof that inquiry, once set free, refuses to remain confined. Philosophy, having survived the hostility of cities and tyrants, must also survive disagreement within its own walls. This awareness reshapes Plato's sense of authorship. He no longer thinks of his dialogues as possessions, but as invitations. He expects them to be misunderstood, argued against, revised, and even rejected. This expectation does not diminish their value, it completes it. Writing, like teaching, is now understood as planting rather than building, an act whose outcomes cannot be predicted or controlled. Emotionally, this phase carries a quiet elevation, distinct from earlier triumphs. There is no exhilaration, only steadiness. Plato feels no urge to summarize his life or defend his choices. He knows that explanation belongs to the living, not to the departing. What mattered has already been enacted. The arc of his life no longer seeks justification. It simply holds. Plato's reflections on immortality grow more symbolic. He does not speak of personal survival with urgency or certainty. Instead, he returns to the idea that participation in truth connects the finite to something enduring. A life devoted to inquiry leaves traces not in memory alone, but in orientation, in the way later minds learn to ask questions, to pause before asserting, to seek coherence rather than victory. This, Plato senses, is the only immortality worth pursuing. The academy continues its routines as Plato steps back further. Conversations unfold without his guidance. Debates resolve or dissolve on their own terms. The grove feels less like a creation and more like an ecosystem, sustained by habits rather than authority. Plato observes this with satisfaction. It confirms his deepest belief that philosophy must be lived communally to survive individually. Athens itself becomes almost incidental. Plato no longer frames his work in relation to the city's failures or promises. The questions he has raised now exceed any single political context. They belong to human beings wherever they struggle with power, desire, ignorance, and hope. The city that once defined his crisis now appears as one episode within a much larger story. As death approaches, Plato does not dramatize it. There are no final teachings, no ceremonial gestures. His departure is consistent with his life, quiet, measured, and unadorned. Those around him sense that something is ending, but not collapsing. The atmosphere is not one of loss alone, but of transition. Philosophy does not retreat with him. It remains. The emotional rhythm settles into its final descent, not toward despair, but toward rest. Plato's questions no longer press for immediate answers. They linger, patient, trusting that time will continue the work he can no longer do. He accepts this with calm, aware that philosophy's strength lies precisely in its refusal to conclude. Plato's final days are not marked by revelation, but by coherence. The life that began in crisis and confusion ends in alignment. Thought and action, belief and practice, inquiry and restraint have converged. The boy who once imagined political glory has become a man who understands influence without command, authority without coercion. In this settling, Plato completes the arc of his life. He has not solved the problems of the world, nor expected to. He has shaped a way of confronting them that can be renewed endlessly. This, he understands, is enough. Plato's death arrives without spectacle, as his life now requires no punctuation. The body ceases quietly, and the grove continues to breathe, to gather voices, to hold questions in motion. There is no vacuum where he stood. This, more than any monument, is the final proof of his success. He has built something that does not need him to survive. And in doing so, he has answered the central question that haunted him since the day Socrates drank the poison. How does wisdom endure in a world that so often destroys it? The answer is not victory, not persuasion, not power. It is continuity. Plato's life resolves into this single insight, earned through crisis, humiliation, temptation, and restraint. Philosophy survives not by conquering the city, but by outlasting it, not by ruling directly, but by shaping those who will one day rule. And just as importantly, those who will question rulers when they forget themselves. After his death, the academy does not close. It does not fracture into sects defined by loyalty to his memory. It continues, imperfectly, argumentatively, alive. Students teach students. Dialogues circulate, misunderstood in places, clarified in others. Plato's refusal to speak in doctrines ensures that no single interpretation can claim him fully. His thought remains mobile, resistant to capture, alive precisely because it cannot be finalized. This is Plato's quiet immortality, not the preservation of his opinions, but the preservation of a way of thinking. He has taught generations how to doubt without despair, how to seek order without tyranny, how to imagine justice without mistaking imagination for reality. His influence spreads not through decrees or institutions of power, but through habits of mind that reproduce themselves whenever a person pauses before certainty and chooses examination instead. The paradox that defined his life now defines his legacy. He is remembered not as a ruler, yet he shapes rulers; not as a lawgiver, yet he reshapes law; not as a revolutionary, yet he transforms the foundations upon which revolutions later justify themselves. Plato's power is invisible, operating beneath the surface of Western thought, guiding questions long after the contexts that produced them have vanished. The dialogues live on as unresolved invitations. Readers encounter Socrates and find themselves unsettled, provoked, drawn into conversations that refuse to end neatly. This refusal is deliberate. Plato understood that closure breeds complacency. By leaving questions open, he ensures that philosophy remains a practice rather than a possession. Each generation must enter the dialogue anew, earning understanding through effort rather than inheritance. Over centuries, cities rise and fall. Empires declare themselves eternal and then disappear. Yet Plato's questions remain intact. What is justice when law fails? What is knowledge when opinion dominates? What kind of education produces not cleverness, but wisdom? These questions outlive the Peloponnesian War, outlive Athens, outlive even the academy itself as a physical place. They migrate, translate, adapt, and persist. This persistence fulfills the emotional arc that began in despair. The young man who watched his city condemn its wisest citizen could not have imagined this outcome. He could not have known that the failure of Athens would become the foundation of something far larger. Plato did not redeem the city that killed Socrates. He rendered it unnecessary. Wisdom no longer depends on the tolerance of any single polis. It has learned to travel. In the end, Plato settles not into silence, but into diffusion. His thought becomes part of the intellectual atmosphere, shaping how later minds understand truth, reality, and responsibility. He does not demand reverence. He invites participation. Those who approach him seeking answers find questions instead. Those who approach him seeking authority find method. Those who approach him seeking certainty find discipline. The final legacy is not comfort, but orientation. Plato teaches how to live in a world where power resists examination, where desire distorts judgment, where justice is fragile and incomplete. He does not promise resolution. He promises coherence, the possibility of aligning one's inner life with something truer than convenience or fear. As the story eases to rest, the tone softens, lengthening into calm. Plato's life no longer presses forward, it settles outward, becoming background, becoming structure, becoming the quiet scaffolding beneath centuries of thought. The urgency that once drove him has transformed into patience that sustains others. The boy, born into aristocratic expectation, the student shattered by injustice, the exile shaped by wandering, the builder disciplined by failure, the teacher tempered by age, all resolve into a single enduring figure, not a hero crowned by history, but a guardian of inquiry who ensured that wisdom would never again depend on one voice alone. Plato's life ends, and something far larger continues.